In episode 90, titled Common Lateral Paths, SMB, RDP, SSH, WinRM, WMI, we focus on the everyday services that quietly make movement between systems possible in real networks. These services exist because organizations need remote administration, file sharing, and interactive access to keep work moving, and attackers take advantage of the same convenience. The key is that lateral movement is often less about exotic exploits and more about using legitimate pathways with the wrong credentials or the wrong exposure. When you can recognize which service is in play, what it typically enables, and what prerequisites it requires, you can reason about movement opportunities quickly and responsibly. This episode stays conceptual because Pentest Plus expects you to understand the logic and risk patterns, not to recite a tool's flags. If you learn to connect service exposure, credentials, and policy, you can explain movement in a way defenders can act on.
File sharing paths are a common starting point because remote access often begins with shared resources that were designed for collaboration. Shared folders and distributed storage provide a natural bridge between systems, allowing users and services to move data, run scripts, and access configuration artifacts without logging into a machine interactively. For an attacker, those shared resources can reveal sensitive files, deployment materials, and sometimes credentials embedded in scripts or configuration templates. They can also provide a route to place content in a location another system will trust or execute, depending on how workflows are designed and what permissions exist. Even when the share itself is not executable, it can still become an information advantage that supports further movement decisions. The practical concept is that shared resources create shared trust, and shared trust is where movement chains often begin. Remote desktop paths represent a different style of movement because interactive access depends on credentials and policy, not just connectivity. When remote desktop is permitted, it gives the attacker a user-like experience on the target system, which can dramatically increase what they can observe and do. Policies often control who can access remote desktop, from where, and under what conditions, so exposure alone does not guarantee usable access. Interactive access also increases the likelihood of operational disruption because it can change the state of the target, trigger user-visible artifacts, and create a larger footprint in logs. That said, it is often high leverage because it enables direct visibility into the system's configuration, installed tools, and active sessions. In movement logic, remote desktop is powerful but carries higher safety considerations, so it should be treated as a controlled option rather than a default. Secure shell paths provide remote command access over encrypted channels, which makes them common in environments that rely on centralized administration for servers and appliances. The encryption protects confidentiality of the session, but it does not change the fundamental security question: who is allowed to authenticate, and what they are allowed to do once connected. Secure shell access can be high impact because it enables direct command execution and supports automation, which means an attacker can move quickly if credentials are valid and privileges are sufficient.
This service is often exposed widely inside environments because administrators need reliable access, and that wide exposure can become a movement surface if segmentation and identity controls are loose.
Because it is a command channel, it can also be used with minimal interaction if the goal is to validate access and stop, which aligns well with safe assessment practices. Conceptually, secure shell is a conduit that becomes dangerous when strong authentication and least privilege are not enforced. Remote management paths, including Windows native management interfaces, are especially important because administrative interfaces allow powerful control without requiring a full interactive desktop. These pathways are designed for legitimate administration at scale, and that design makes them attractive for attackers because they can produce high capability with a relatively small footprint. When remote management is exposed broadly, a valid credential can become a rapid expansion mechanism,
especially if the credential is privileged on the target. These interfaces also tend to be trusted internally, meaning security teams may not monitor them as aggressively as they monitor internet-facing traffic, even though the impact can be just as severe. The core idea is that remote management is an amplifier. It turns authentication success into operational control quickly. In a Pen Test Plus framing, you want to understand that these are not just ports, they are control planes. Movement opportunities appear when service exposure meets credentials, because reachability answers only the "can I talk to it" question, while credentials answer the "will it accept me" question. If a service is reachable, but you do not have valid authentication, then movement may not be feasible without additional weaknesses, and reckless attempts create noise and risk. If you have credentials, but the service is not reachable from your foothold, then movement is constrained by segmentation and routing, which can be a security control when it is enforced correctly. The most dangerous situation is when both are true. The service is reachable, and the credentials are accepted, especially if policy grants elevated access by default. This is why defenders care about reducing unnecessary exposure and tightening credential scope, because those two controls multiply each other. For the tester, this pairing is the logic. You validate exposure, validate authentication, and then decide whether further action adds meaningful proof.
Clue patterns help you reason about which paths are even plausible, and they often look like open ports, reachable hosts, and evidence of administrative tooling in the environment. Open ports indicate that a service is listening, but they also hint at the system's role, such as whether it is likely a server, an endpoint, or a management node.
Reachable hosts matter because a port that exists on paper is irrelevant if segmentation prevents access from your current foothold.
Evidence of admin tooling can show up as installed management agents, scripts, configuration references, or documentation that indicates how administrators normally connect, which often reveals the intended pathways.
When you combine these clues, you can infer which services are worth validating and which are likely to be dead ends or risky distractions. The exam-relevant skill is not memorizing port numbers, but interpreting what the presence of a service implies about workflow and trust.
Consider a scenario where you have a foothold on a workstation and you detect that multiple services are reachable on a nearby server, and you need to prioritize which one to validate first based on risk and leverage. You might see that a file share is available, remote desktop appears reachable, and a remote management interface is present, but you also know that interactive sessions create higher footprint and risk. A disciplined decision would prioritize the path that yields useful information with minimal intrusion, such as validating whether the file share can be accessed and what level of access is granted, because that can confirm credential scope and reveal whether sensitive resources are exposed. If that validation suggests elevated privilege or access to configuration artifacts, you may then consider whether a remote management path is justified to demonstrate a boundary crossing with minimal changes. Remote desktop might be deferred unless it is necessary to prove an objective that cannot be demonstrated through less intrusive means. This scenario illustrates that prioritization is not about what is possible, but about what is safest and most informative first.
Safe practices for validating lateral paths emphasize least intrusive checks, minimal changes, and clear documentation at every step. Least intrusive checks means you confirm reachability and authentication in a controlled way, choosing actions that do not modify system state or create broad noise across the network. Minimal changes means you avoid actions that install components, alter configurations, or leave artifacts that defenders must clean up later, because those steps increase operational risk. Clear documentation means recording the starting point, the service observed, the method of access, and the exact evidence that confirms the access level, because your report depends on traceable reasoning.
Safe practice also includes stopping once the objective is proven, rather than continuing to see what else works, because additional activity adds risk without necessarily adding value.
In movement work, professionalism shows up in the footprint you choose to leave behind.
A common pitfall is assuming that service availability implies permission or safe usage, when in reality, availability only means the service is listening. Permission depends on authentication and authorization policy, and a service can be reachable while still properly secured, so overconfidence leads to wasted time and noisy behavior. Another pitfall is treating an interactive path as the default because it feels familiar, even when a non-interactive validation could prove the same point with less disruption. It is also easy to misread clues, such as assuming an admin interface is acceptable to touch just because it is reachable, when scope or operational sensitivity restricts it. Broad, repeated authentication attempts are particularly risky because they can trigger lockouts and incident response, which harms the engagement and the client.
The disciplined approach is to treat reachability as an observation, treat authentication as a controlled validation, and treat further action as a decision with a clear objective. Quick wins for reducing these lateral paths as attack surfaces tend to focus on restricting management exposure and enforcing strong authentication policies. Restricting exposure means limiting which hosts can reach management services, placing them behind management networks or jump hosts, and ensuring that endpoints cannot arbitrarily initiate management connections to critical servers. Strong authentication policies reduce the usefulness of stolen credentials, particularly for high-privilege access pathways, and they also improve detection when combined with monitoring for unusual authentication patterns. These quick wins matter because they reduce the chance that a single credential compromise turns into rapid expansion across the environment. They also improve compartmentalization, which is a defensive theme you should recognize across Pentest Plus domains. When exposure is narrow and authentication is strong, movement becomes harder, noisier, and more detectable. Reporting language for common lateral paths should clearly state the service, the access method, and the resulting capability gained, because that is what stakeholders need to understand and fix. A good report explains that a specific service was reachable from a specific foothold, that a specific credential or access context was accepted, and that the result enabled a defined capability such as file access, command execution, or interactive control. It also ties the capability to impact, explaining what that access would allow an attacker to do next, while remaining careful not to disclose sensitive secrets in the report. Clear language distinguishes between what was confirmed and what was possible but not validated due to scope or safety constraints. When the path description is precise, defenders can reproduce the issue, adjust segmentation, tighten policy, and verify the fix using the same logic. The report should read like a chain of evidence, not like a story of exploration. A compact memory anchor helps you keep the major categories straight: share, shell, desktop, management, evidence. Share reminds you that shared resources can expose data and enable trust-based pathways even without direct system login. Shell captures encrypted remote command channels that can provide strong leverage when credentials are valid and privileges are adequate. Desktop represents interactive access that is powerful but higher footprint and higher disruption risk. Management points to administrative control planes that can amplify access quickly and should be tightly restricted and monitored. Evidence keeps you grounded in disciplined validation, because the purpose of testing these paths is to prove risk with minimal action and clear documentation. As we conclude episode 90,
The most important takeaway is that common movement services are powerful because they are legitimate, and legitimacy is what makes them both useful for operations and attractive to attackers. File sharing, remote desktop, secure shell, and remote management interfaces all become movement paths when exposure and credentials align, and your job is to recognize that alignment and validate it responsibly. The first clue you should listen for is reachability from your current foothold, because if a service is not reachable, it is not a practical movement option, and time spent chasing it is wasted or noisy. Once reachability is confirmed, you can then weigh credentials, policy, and objective value to decide the smallest safe step that proves impact. When you train yourself to listen for that first clue and follow the logic deliberately, you move with purpose rather than impulse. That disciplined reasoning is exactly what Pentest Plus expects and what professional engagements demand.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.